Still interested in comic book collecting? If you click that video, then I'll take that as a yes, and I'm so glad that you are. So if you're ready and you got your cup of coffee, let's get to it. So you may have overheard some people yickety-yakking about Golden Age this and Silver Age that, and you want to know more about it. Let's find out those answers. Welcome to the CBCG Beginner Series, issue number 2, 4 plus more comic book ages, or as I'm beginning to refer to them as CBAs. Also, real quick, before we begin, towards the end of the video, I have a bonus question for all of you to answer, so stay tuned for that. I always like to start out with the why when I approach situations. So the question is, why should you know the CBAs and how would it help you? Knowing the comic book ages, or CBAs, is no different than knowing, for example, that World War II was in the 1940s, color TV started in the 1950s, Apple formed in the 1970s, and, if you're into classic rock, like I am, John Lennon was unfortunately killed in the 1980s. These 4 examples will include 2 important aspects that will help you maintain your CBA structure, which are points of interest and frames of reference. These 2 aspects can easily be applied to the CBAs, so why should you know them? Easy. Because just like the 4 examples earlier from our own history, it's knowledge. And the CBAs will give you a sound structure to your overall collecting adventure. And knowledge is a superpower. And with this newly discovered superpower, you will gain confidence, comfortability, and understanding. After you watch this video, you should have a basic knowledge or superpower that you can take out into the comic book collecting world to aid you. Not only in collecting, but in conversations as well. I won't get too specific about the CBAs because this is a basic introductory video into the CBAs. We'll keep it brief until a later video when more details are necessary. But for now, we'll keep it simple. Real quick before we list out the ages, there's something you should keep in mind. The comic book ages are very rough and very opinionated. What I mean is people and certain communities have varying perspectives on what dates and events they choose to recognize as boundaries for the CBAs. Currently, there's nothing really set in stone for any of them, so no one is truly right or wrong for the most part. So take these dates with a grain of salt. Let's go. Let's start with the frames of reference, or ages. The 4 CBAs that are primarily and widely recognized today by the majority of collectors are the Golden Age, Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Modern Age. There are other age names out there that some collectors and communities use, but they aren't recognized by all collectors. More on that in a little bit. First up is the Golden Age, with an estimated years of 1938 to 1956. That's a span of 18 years. Remember those historic examples from earlier that we discussed? Those were points of interest, and just like those, the CBAs have plenty of points of interest. I'll give you 3 examples from each age for now. A couple of huge points of interest are the first appearance of Superman, although not in a Superman self-titled series, and Batman, which is also not in a self-titled series. Number 1 is Superman's first appearance in 1938, which was Action Comics number 1. Number 2 is Batman's first appearance in 1939, which was Detective Comics. And you might have thought Detective Comics number 1, but it wasn't. Surprisingly, it was Detective Comics number 27. And number 3 is that there were new genres of comic books being introduced in the 1940s, such as war, westerns, and science fiction, to name a few. The second CBA on the list today is Silver Age, with estimated years of 1956 to 1970. That's spanning around a 14-year era. With too many points of interest to name in this beginner series, here are 3 to start you off. Number 1 is the first appearance of Spider-Man in 1962. And just like Superman and Batman, Spider-Man was also not in a self-titled series. Spider-Man first appeared in the Amazing Fantasy comic books. And if you're new to comic book collecting, you might be thinking, okay, Spider-Man first appeared in Amazing Fantasy number 1. But that would be false, as he first appeared in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Then you also might be thinking, well, if Spider-Man is in Amazing Fantasy 15, then Amazing Fantasy 1 through 14 would be worth getting into. Well, that may be true, but there wasn't an Amazing Fantasy 1 through 14, and no one seems to talk about it as much as they probably should. To catch you up in this beginner series, without taking too much of a deep dive, this is how it came to be. It started with Amazing Adventures, a series of 1 through 6 back in 1961. Now, there was an Amazing Adventures that actually started in the 1950s, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the one that started in 1961 that had the Marvel Publishing attached to it. After that, it was retitled to Amazing Adult Fantasy, beginning with issue number 7 and running through issue number 14 in 1962. Then it was retitled once again to what we now know as Amazing Fantasy in 1962. That started with issue number 15, the first appearance of Spider-Man. This is just a quick and dirty recap to kind of get you caught up. There's so many more details involved, but we'll do that later. Quick question though here. Why is Superman and Batman spelled with no hyphen in their name? But when you look at Spider-Man, in most comics, it has a hyphen. I'm curious about this. If you look back at Amazing Fantasy number 15, Spider-Man, although 2 words, it didn't have a hyphen. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get back to the Silver Age. Number 2 on this list is the first appearance of The Flash, which was technically in the 1940s, and we would need another deep dive to get into more details on that. But for this series and most collectors, it was revamped and reinvented, I guess, so to speak, of The Flash and what's considered the first appearance, which occurred in 1956. And you guessed it, just like others previously mentioned, not in a self-titled series either, as that would come later in 1959, but rather in showcase number 4 with the Barry Allen version of The Flash, which would not be the original Flash of Jay Garrick that was in the 40s. Number 3, and last on this list for the Silver Age, is the Talking Animal Superheroes, which actually crossed over and overlapped from the Golden Age into the Silver Age. Some examples of those are Mighty Mouse. Did any of you ever watch the Mighty Mouse cartoons? So good to watch. It was even a little bit before my time, as far as watching them as a live show, but I did see plenty of reruns growing up as a kid. They were great. Then there was Atomic Mouse and Atomic Rabbit, who was later renamed to Atomic Bunny. And I don't know about you, but I prefer Atomic Rabbit over Atomic Bunny. That's just my opinion. The third CBA on this list is the Bronze Age, from 1970 to 1985, spanning an era of 15 years. So as the Golden and Silver Ages were before my time, the Bronze Age was the time where I actually started collecting comic books. Born in the mid-1970s, I'm Generation X or Gen X, so I basically started later in the Bronze Age in the early to mid-1980s. Here are a few points of interest for you for the Bronze Age. Number 1, not necessarily a comic book or character, but more of an event. In 1970, that's when Jack Kirby left Marvel Comics and went to DC. And if you don't know who Jack Kirby is, we can deep dive into that later on. But for now, consider him a father and pioneer of comic book creations. Number 2, and spoiler alert, in case you didn't already know, you can skip ahead about 5 to 10 seconds if you don't want to know. It was the death of Gwen Stacy. And if you want to know when and where that happened, then check out 1973's Spider-Man's issues number 121 and 122, which also contains another death. But I'll let you read about it to find out more information on that. Number 3. How about a point that's a little bit more happier than talking about death? In earlier ages, we rarely saw any minority characters, especially with their own book. Well, the Bronze Age has that. Starting off with none other in the self-titled 1972 first appearance of Luke Cage, Hero for Hire number 1, who would then be followed by plenty other characters of color and all sorts of backgrounds. The fourth CBA on today's list is widely accepted for the majority of collectors, and I'll explain this later as the Modern Age. From 1985 to the present day, which is, believe it or not, currently sitting at a whopping 38 years. During the Bronze Age, I collected comics here and there, but I wasn't full-blown into collecting as I have been within the past 10 years or so. And guess where I got most of my comics as a kid growing up? Well, did you guess? Convenience stores. That's right, comic books were sold in convenience stores, and many other places for that matter, in those handy-dandy spinner racks. Sometimes I even got them for free. And no, I didn't steal them. My grandma used to work at a 7-Eleven, and she would buy me some comics and give me free drinks and snacks whenever I come through. Ah, what it was like to be a kid. I digress. Going from Bronze to Modern Age is a little bit blurry in most people's eyes, as far as something significant taking place or triggering the switch. On the Marvel side, we had a lot of overlap with particular runs or eras of comic books, as well as creators who were working on them. On the DC side, we had the Crisis on Infinite Earths set. This would be the original set of that, to be clear, which happens to be one of the runs that I personally own in my own collection. Check it out if you get the chance. Here are a few points for the Modern Age, at least in the early stages of the so-called Modern Age. So of course, I'll mention number 1, the Crisis on Infinite Earths series. The original series from 1985 to 1986. It was a 12-book series. This is a limited series crossover event in the DC world. It was meant to reset the continuity in DC and reduce or eliminate the multiverses and bring it back down to one. There is so much going on in this series that includes so many different characters that it's well worth the read if you get the chance. Number 2. The first appearance of Deadpool. Of course, my favorite character, I have to mention it. Also, not in a self-titled series, but in New Mutants number 98, which debuted in 1991. This is my favorite comic book character, which is why New Mutants number 98 is my number 1 holy grail of all comic books. This book also contains the first appearances of Gideon and Copycat. I have a story to share about this particular comic book, but I'll do that in a different video. For now, let's move on to number 3. Number 3 on this list is Image Comics was founded in 1992, which was a major event led by several familiar and favorite people, such as Rob Liefeld, Todd McFarlane, and Jim Lee, to name a few. Number 4. I know, I added another one here, but since we're talking about Image Comics, I felt that it was necessary. The 4th point of interest to mention for the Modern Age is the first appearance of Spawn in his own self-titled series in 1992. Okay, so those are the 4 widely accepted CBAs by most collectors. The Modern Age can't go on forever, and it wouldn't make any sense if it did. Currently, just to reiterate, the Modern Age is in its 38th year. This is the longest running age so far. Now let's be honest here. I would consider labeling something modern that is within the last 3 to 5 years. I'll give it that. By definition though, the word modern means relating to the present or recent times as opposed to the remote past. If we use this definition, we can't go back to the Modern Age bracket and say that something from the 80s, 90s, early mid-2000s is considered modern. I would say maybe modern could go back to 2020, and even that would be a stretch. I would like to see someone from the top echelon in the comic book world of people actually get this changed and fixed, so that we, as collectors, have a more solid structure as a guideline. There are, however, collectors, groups, peoples, and communities in the comic book collecting world who have broken down the Modern Age into separate categories. Here is a couple that has been suggested that you might see or hear about. I won't give any points of interest here, since these are still currently encapsulated inside the Modern Age. First, we have the Copper Age, which is 1985 to 2000. That would put it currently at 15 years. The second one is called the Plastic Age, which would run from 2000 to the present day. That would give it a span of around 23 years. I wouldn't mind seeing the Copper Age set in place. I think that's a good title for an age. But I can't say that I'm really a fan of the Plastic Age label. In my opinion, I believe the Modern Age would just need to be moved to the present time. For example, if we keep the copper age at 1985 to 2000, we could either keep the plastic age not at 2000 to present, but more like 2000 to 2020 if we keep the plastic age title. Or we could rename it to something else. That would give it a run of 20 years. After that, simply re-add back the modern age title as a placeholder label for 2020 to the present day. Just like the golden, silver, and bronze ages, they were all modern when it was the present time. Modern can't really be a solid name for an age bracket. It needs to be a placeholder label until we figure out an age-appropriate name for that bracket. Before we go, I should mention one more noteworthy CBA. It is the predecessor to the Golden Age, and it is none other than the Platinum Age. From estimated years 1897 to 1938 and bolstering a massive 41-year span. The Platinum Age goes back to the origin of comic strips that were seen in newspapers and magazines. That eventually led to the individualized comic books predating the characters we know and love today. But there were still a few characters in this 41-year span that the masses would completely recognize even now, and I'll give you just a few examples. Little Orphan Annie, featured in Little Orphan Annie number 1, 1926. Popeye, featured in Popeye Cartoon Book number 1, 1934. Dagwood, featured in Ace Comics number 1 in 1937. Mutt and Jeff, featured in The Adventures of Mutt and Jeff number 1, 1920. Buck Rogers, featured in August issue of Amazing Stories 1928. Have you ever watched any of the old school Buck Rogers TV shows? I watched it when I was a kid. It only had 2 seasons from 1979 to 1981. If you didn't watch it, then you might have seen the Daffy Duck cartoon, where he kind of imitates Buck Rogers a little bit by being Duck Dodgers. Except it wasn't the 25th century, it was the 24th and a half century. I've seen that one a lot of times. It's pretty good. Next is Tarzan, featured in the illustrated Tarzan book number 1, Tarzan of the Apes, which was in 1929. Lastly, Felix the Cat. And hopefully I don't mess this up too bad, but it was featured in Felix der Kater number 1, 1927, which I guess was originated in Germany, and I had no idea until I did some research. So that's kind of got a cool factor. Okay, so I mentioned more than just a few here, but I was having fun kind of digging around in history and looking up some stuff, so it's entertaining. Do you recognize any of these Platinum Age comics, these characters? If so, let me know in the comments below and who you like. Or if I forgot someone, just put it in the comments of who you like. Do you need to know the comic book ages or CBAs to collect comics? No. Will it make it easier for you in your comic book collecting journey? In my opinion, yes. That's why understanding the CBAs is fundamental and essential, at least in a brief manner, while you're in your introductory stages of comic book collecting. As your journey continues, your superpower will grow and strengthen. And by that I mean your knowledge of the CBAs and the events contained within them. As promised, the bonus question I would like for you to answer in the comments below. If you had to list the CBAs in order of your favorite to least favorite, what order would you place them in? I look forward to reading your comments about it. And if you're curious about what order I would place the CBAs in, you should be able to see them over here beside me. So that's all I have for you in this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it and gained a better understanding of the CBAs, why you should know them, and how they can help you. Remember, we'll dive into deeper details in other videos, as this is mainly for beginning comic book collectors. And that's okay if you're a beginner, because we were all beginners at once, and we always have room for more people in the comic book collecting communities. That's why I'm here, as well as many other YouTubers out there. Speaking of communities, consider subscribing to the channel and joining this one. I'd love to have you here. Thanks for watching the video until the end, and until the next video, enjoy your coffee, enjoy your comics, and enjoy your day.